The snow wasn't clean anymore. It was churned into black sludge by tracks and boots packed down with blood, and lit up in sudden white flashes every time Soviet artillery found a target. This wasn't a battle that unfolded neatly across a map. It was a slow execution carried out in fog, mud, and freezing wind, men swallowed by ditches, vehicles dying where they sank, whole columns reduced to burning shapes on the horizon. In late January, the Red Army struck like a hammer from two directions, Konev from the south, Vatutin from the north. Their tank corps drove forward through the winter haze with one aim: close the jaws, seal the ring, and turn the Dnieper line into a grave. Not a retreat, not a withdrawal, an encirclement, another Stalingrad, but in open country. And inside that tightening circle were tens of thousands of Germans and auxiliaries, units already worn thin from months of retreat, along with some of the most notorious formations in the pocket. Western European volunteers thrown into the meat grinder of Ukraine, fighting and dying in villages they couldn't pronounce, for a cause that was collapsing under them. The Russians did not need elegance, they needed momentum. Rocket artillery shrieked overhead, Stalin's organs, followed by infantry waves that kept coming even when the ground was already carpeted with wrecks and bodies. Roads became rivers, rivers became traps. The wounded froze where they lay. Horses screamed in the mud as tanks pushed past them like they weren't even there. And when the ring finally began to crush, when the pocket tried to move, when the columns choked on blown bridges, when searchlights cut through the night and turned men into silhouettes, de Grelle would remember the scene in one bleak detail. Some still tried to crawl. This is Korsun, Cherkasy, the battle where an entire force fought its way through snow and fire for a single word: freedom, and where thousands never made it far enough to even see the river. On January 26, 1944, deep into the Ukrainian winter, the armoured spearheads of General Ivan Konev's 2nd Ukrainian Front smashed into the German positions at Kapitanovka. Snow, ice and churned earth swallowed vehicles and men alike as Soviet tanks forced their way through defensive lines already stretched to breaking point. Lieutenant General Nikolaus von Bormann, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps, watched the attack unfold in disbelief. Regardless of losses, he stressed regardless, entire masses of Soviet infantry surged westward around midday, moving straight past German panzers that fired at them with everything they had. The ground was littered with wrecks and bodies, yet the Soviet advance did not slow. Momentum, not preservation, was the objective. 2 days later, the trap snapped shut. Konev's forces linked up with General Nikolai Vatutin's 1st Ukrainian Front at Zvenigorodka. The long-planned encirclement was complete. Konev, fully aware of what this meant, made his intent clear. This time the Germans were caught in the pincers, and there would be no escape. For the Soviet command, this was not simply another breakthrough. It was the opportunity to annihilate a large German force in open country, echoing the destruction inflicted at Stalingrad the year before. At the center of the collapsing front lay the Korsun salient. Anchored around the airfield and clinging to the western bank of the Dnieper River between Konev and Cherkasy, formations of Army Group South remained dangerously exposed. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, fully aware of the risk, flew to Hitler's headquarters at Rastenburg to demand permission to withdraw his overextended right wing. The front was thinning, the flanks were naked, and Soviet armor was already rolling behind German lines. Hitler refused. Still convinced that the tide of war could be reversed through sheer will, he ordered the salient held. That decision handed the Soviet High Command, known as Stavka, exactly what it needed. Under the direction of Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Red Army executed the largest encirclement of German forces since Stalingrad. The disaster was the culmination of a trend that had begun months earlier. Since the defeat at Kursk the previous summer, Germany had lost the initiative on the Eastern Front. The Red Army now possessed overwhelming numerical and material superiority, allowing Soviet commanders to decide when and where to strike. German elite units were rushed from sector to sector, thrown in as emergency fire brigades to plug gaps and blunt breakthroughs. Sometimes they succeeded temporarily, but each intervention came at a cost, and each withdrawal pushed the front further west. Even in retreat, the German army inflicted brutal losses. From July 1st to September 30th, 1943, the Red Army suffered roughly 4 casualties for every German one. Entire Soviet formations were burned down in frontal assaults, artillery barrages, and tank battles that left fields blackened and frozen with the dead. Yet the Soviets absorbed the losses and pressed forward regardless. By the winter of 1944, the balance was no longer about who bled more, but who could endure bleeding the longest. Konev opened the battle on January 25th, unleashing a crushing artillery barrage against German positions west of Burtki. Shells tore into frozen ground and shallow trenches as Soviet guns fired in relentless waves, designed not just to destroy but to disorient. The Germans expected a major attack, but there was little they could do beyond bracing themselves. Fog blanketed the battlefield, grounding aircraft and denying the defenders any meaningful air support. Once again, the weather became an invisible combatant. Unseasonable thaws alternated with sudden freezes, turning roads into deep mud, then hard ice, and back again. Vehicles bogged down, horses slipped, and wounded men froze where they fell. 7 Soviet rifle divisions, supported by tanks, slammed into the seam between German formations. At the point of impact stood barely 1,500 men of the 389th Infantry Division, holding the junction between the 11th Corps and the 47th Panzer Corps. They were simply overrun. Positions collapsed within hours as Soviet infantry poured through gaps opened by artillery and armour. Exploiting the breach, the 20th and 29th Tank Corps of Colonel General Pavel Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army drove hard toward Zvenygorodka, advancing through Kapitanovka in a rolling mass of steel and infantry. Lieutenant General von Bormann reacted immediately, counter-attacking from the south with what remained of the 11th and 14th Panzer Divisions. Both formations were depleted, their tanks worn down by months of fighting and constant retreat. Around Kapitanovka, the battlefield dissolved into chaos. Tanks fired at point-blank range through smoke and snow. Infantry scattered, regrouped, and scattered again. For a brief moment, von Bormann managed to cut the Soviet penetration and sever the corridor. But the pause was short-lived. Rotmistrov ordered his leading units to continue forward regardless, throwing the 18th Tank Corps and the 5th Guards Cavalry Corps into the fight to force the corridor open once more. One day after Konev struck, Vatutin launched his own offensive. His 6th Tank Army went forward under similar conditions of fog, mud, and confusion. The main thrust, attacking southeast from Tinovka against the 7th Corps of General Hans Valentine Hube's 1st Panzer Army, quickly bogged down under heavy resistance and terrain that strangled movement. But elsewhere, the Soviets found weakness. A secondary attack at Koshevato shattered the fragile connection between the 198th and 88th Infantry Divisions. The line split apart. A deep wedge was driven between the 7th Corps to the west and the 42nd Corps to the northeast, widening the encirclement with every passing hour. The violence of the bombardment left a lasting impression on those trapped beneath it. Waves of 132mm rockets screamed overhead, their howling roar adding to the already overwhelming noise of artillery and explosions. Captain Georg Grosjohann of the 198th Division recalled how there were only seconds to react. Weapons were grabbed, coats were pulled on blindly. Men threw themselves into narrow ditches, hastily dug and covered with logs, earth, and hay. When they emerged minutes later, the hut they had just occupied no longer existed. In its place were only splintered beams, torn earth, and fragments scattered across the frozen ground. In savage, close-range fighting, the 2 Ukrainian fronts finally sealed the encirclement at Zvenygorodka on January 28th. 2 German corps were trapped inside the pocket. To the northwest stood Lieutenant General Theo Helmut Lieb's 42nd Corps, part of the 1st Panzer Army. Its corps consisted of Corps Detachment B, remnants of the 112th, 255th, and 332nd Infantry Divisions, alongside the 88th Infantry Division. These units were already exhausted, hollowed out by months of retreat and constant combat. The southeastern portion of the pocket was held by 11th Corps under General Wilhelm Stemmermann, belonging to General Otto Wöhler's 8th Army. 11th Corps included the 5th SS Wiking Panzer Division, the SS Assault Brigade Wallonian, and the 57th, 72nd, and 389th Infantry Divisions. Scattered among both corps were additional artillery batteries, an assault gun battalion, and several independent infantry battalions. In total, roughly 59,000 men were trapped. Among them were around 5,000 so-called Hiwis, Russians and Ukrainians, who had volunteered or been coerced into German service as auxiliaries. Their fate would be no different from the rest. Stemmermann was appointed overall commander of the encircled force, which soon became known as Group Stemmermann. The situation was grim from the outset. Many divisions existed only on paper, reduced to battle groups too weak to conduct sustained offensive operations. Anti-tank weapons were scarce, and the entire pocket possessed barely 40 operational tanks and self-propelled guns. Stemmermann understood the reality immediately. He ordered what supplies could be gathered set aside and organized distribution as best he could. Local horse-drawn sledges, known as panjes, were pressed into service to haul supplies forward. On January 29th, 23 Ju-52 transport aircraft landed at Korsun, delivering ammunition, food and fuel. In the weeks that followed, 8th Air Corps flew repeated missions through snowstorms, Soviet anti-aircraft fire and fighter patrols to keep the pocket alive and evacuate the wounded. Every landing and takeoff carried the risk of annihilation. Overestimating the number of German troops trapped, Zhukov abandoned plans to push further west toward the southern Bug River and instead committed both Ukrainian fronts to crushing the pocket outright. Soviet pressure intensified from all directions. Stemmermann responded by shifting forces to the southwest, determined to prevent the Red Army from widening its corridor of penetration. Corps Detachment B was moved to reinforce the hard-pressed 88th Infantry Division along the Rose River. Fighting erupted across a string of villages, Stebliv, Olshana, Silistya and Kvitki, each becoming a miniature battlefield of burning houses, shattered streets and frozen corpses. At Olshana, the situation teetered on collapse when Soviet forces broke into the rear areas. 4 assault guns from the SS Wiking Division were rushed forward and struck in night fighting. Replacement troops and rear service units, barely trained and poorly armed, clung to the vehicles as they advanced. In the darkness, muzzle flashes lit up the snow as Soviet units were driven back in confusion. It was a rare local success, bought at high cost. Elsewhere along the northern edge of the pocket, those gains were erased as the Soviet 27th Army advanced into ground abandoned by Corps Detachment B, tightening the noose still further. On the outside, Lieutenant General von Bormann reorganized what strength he had left. Trusting infantry to hold his eastern flank, he concentrated his remaining armour further west, closer to the encircled troops. From February 1st onward, the 47th Panzer Corps focused on forcing a crossing of the Spolka River and closing the gap to Group Stemmermann. The 11th Panzer Division managed to seize a bridge at Iskrena, a rare stroke of luck. But, as the 2nd Panther tank rumbled across, the structure collapsed beneath its weight. Engineers rushed forward under fire, working desperately to restore the crossing while Soviet artillery searched for targets. Relief came just in time. The arrival of the 3rd Panzer Division secured 11th Panzer's exposed right flank, blocking a counterattack by Rotmistrov's 49th Rifle Corps and 29th Tank Corps. Tanks and infantry clashed across frozen fields and wooded gullies, the fighting close, violent, and unresolved. For the trapped Germans inside the pocket, every hour mattered. Whether the relief force could reach them in time remained uncertain. Flying in direct support of the Panzer divisions was Captain Hans Ulrich Rudel of the Immelmann dive bomber wing. West of Novomir Horod, Rudel sighted a formation of Soviet IL-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft. The Germans called the aircraft Iron Gustav, a grim acknowledgement of its thick armour and ability to absorb punishment. Rudel pushed his cannon-armed Stuka into a steep dive, closing on the formation. The shot was long and risky, but he lined up one of the bulky aircraft and fired anti-tank rounds from his slow-firing cannons. The Sturmovik erupted into flame, disintegrating mid-air and scattering burning debris across the sky. Rudel weaved away under pursuit, dodging Soviet fighters until the sudden appearance of German interceptors forced them to break off. Air superiority, even fleeting, remained vital to the survival of the ground forces below. On the ground, von Bormann waited anxiously for the arrival of the 24th Panzer Division. His plan was to launch a full-scale relief attack in coordination with Huber's 1st Panzer Army. Until now, Hube had been preoccupied with encircling and destroying elements of the Soviet 1st Tank Army in the Balabanova area, leaving him unable to mount a serious effort to relieve Group Stemmermann. That situation was about to change with the launch of Operation Wanda. Moving the necessary forces eastward took days. Rail transport was used whenever possible, as roads deteriorated further with every passing vehicle. Bridges had to be reinforced or rebuilt entirely to bear the weight of 45-ton Panthers and 57-ton Tigers grinding their way forward. Under Operation Wanda, General Hermann Breith's 3rd Panzer Corps was tasked with driving north across the Nikol-Tikich River, then swinging east toward the pocket through Medvin. The intent was ambitious. Soviet 6th Tank Army and 5th Guards Tank Army were to be caught between Breith's Corps and von Vormann's 47th Panzer Corps, crushed before they could react. Leading the advance were the 16th and 17th Panzer Divisions, supported by Heavy Panzer Battalion 506, the improvised Heavy Panzer Regiment Bach, and Assault Gun Battalion 249. In total, Breith assembled 126 tanks and assault guns. Additional reinforcements, another 150 tanks and assault guns, were expected from the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, and the 1st Panzer Division. For early 1944, this concentration of armour represented a rare and powerful striking force for the German army. On February 4th, Breith's armoured spearhead smashed through Soviet infantry, anti-tank positions and minefields belonging to the 104th Rifle Corps north of Novaya Greblia Bagva. Elements of the 16th Panzer Division seized Kosyakovka along the Nikol-Tikich River, only to discover the bridges destroyed. Soviet resistance stiffened by the hour. The 2nd and 6th Tank Armies, along with the 40th Army, poured men and armour into the breach, hammering the German penetration from multiple directions. On the western flank near Tinovka, the 34th Infantry Division and units from Leibstandarte struggled desperately to hold their ground. Lieutenant Colonel Franz Barke later claimed that 31 out of 40 Soviet tanks were destroyed during the fighting around Kosyakovka. Even so, the pressure proved overwhelming. The 16th Panzer Division was forced to abandon the settlement and pull back. Elsewhere, however, 3rd Panzer Corps achieved greater success. On the eastern flank, the 1st and 17th Panzer Divisions, supported by Baker's Regiment and the 198th Infantry Division, pushed forward and captured Vinograd and Repki. The corridor narrowed, the fighting intensified, and the fate of the encircled forces hung on whether this advance could be sustained. The 47th Panzer Corps faced a shorter distance to the pocket than Breith's force, but the reality was far harsher. On February 4th, von Vormann had only 58 operational tanks and assault guns available. His formations were already worn down and locked in continuous fighting against Soviet counterattacks. Then came another blow. On Hitler's direct personal order, issued despite Manstein's strong objections, the 24th Panzer Division, having just completed its exhausting redeployment, was abruptly pulled away and sent back to the 6th Army to shore up the collapsing front around Nikopol. The decision stripped von Vormann of his last real striking power. Any hope of a decisive relief effort vanished. What remained were limited spoiling attacks, designed only to delay and disrupt rather than break through. The mud deepened the suffering on every side. In many areas, only tracked vehicles could move at all. Panthers crawled forward in low gear, engines straining as tracks churned endlessly through thick sludge. Even the wide tracks of Soviet T-34s were sometimes swallowed and immobilized. Fuel consumption skyrocketed, reaching as much as 5 times normal levels. Evacuation became a nightmare. Critically wounded men often died simply because it took too long to get them out. Soldiers marched barefoot after losing their boots to the suction of the mud. Lieutenant Alexander Fadin of the 22nd Tank Brigade recalled that all logistical work had to be done by horses, as wheeled vehicles were useless. Local women and teenagers were pressed into service, carrying ammunition rounds on their shoulders while sinking knee-deep with every step. Overhead, Luftwaffe fighters concentrated on shielding the Ju-52 transports supplying the Panzer spearheads. Flying dangerously low, the lumbering aircraft dropped fuel barrels straight into the mud. Often the barrels landed 200 to 300 yards away from the waiting tanks. Steel cables were attached, and crews winched them in by hand under fire. Ammunition and fuel took priority. Food did not. Panzer crews and grenadiers fought on with little more than hunger in their stomachs, expected to endure just as relentlessly as their machines. Fresh Soviet reinforcements from the 5th and 7th Guards armies slammed into the pocket, increasing the pressure on all sides. Group Stemmermann was forced to abandon its remaining hold on the Dnieper River. Between February 6th and February 8th, Cossacks from the 5th Guards Cavalry Corps, supported by rifle divisions from the 4th Guards Army and the 52nd Army, attempted to split the pocket in two. Fighting degenerated into brutal house-to-house combat among burning wooden huts. At Valyava, the 72nd Infantry Division, backed by armour from the SS Wiking Division, held firm. Amid smoke, fire and collapsing buildings, they blocked repeated Soviet efforts to cut the road between Korsun and Dashukivka. Amid the violence, psychological warfare was also deployed. A Soviet envoy approached the front of the 258th Regiment of Corps Detachment B under a white flag, offering surrender terms. He was politely received, given a glass of French cognac, told that an answer would be provided in due course, and sent back. Other attempts followed. Members of the National Committee for Free Germany, composed of exiled German communists and captured officers who had defected, infiltrated the pocket-wearing German uniforms. Their vice president, General Walter von Seydlitz, broadcast messages urging surrender, promising safety, food and shelter. Millions of leaflets rained down, repeating the same assurances. None of it shook the resolve of Group Stemmermann. The encircled troops ignored the appeals and continued fighting. Soviet efforts to split the pocket failed when Stemmermann executed a timely withdrawal from the southeastern sector. By February 10th, the encirclement had shrunk into a rough triangle, with Morinci at the northern tip, Steblev forming the western base, and Korsun anchoring the east. The airfield at Korsun was already under direct artillery fire, yet 8th Air Corps continued flying supply missions by night, threading through flak and darkness to keep the pocket alive. Outside the encirclement, slowed by mud and mounting Soviet resistance, 3rd Panzer Corps abandoned its sweeping maneuver and shifted to a direct thrust toward Group Stemmermann. Once again, the Gniloy-Tikich River stood in the way. Battle Group Bake, Battle Group Frank from the 1st Panzer Division, and elements of the 16th Panzer Division forced crossings at Bushanka and Frankovka, establishing fragile bridgeheads under fire. One of Baker's Panthers was the first to cross a captured bridge at Frankovka. Its crew was later rewarded with 8 days of leave. A short radio message was sent forward. They were coming. A bridgehead had been secured. On the morning of February 13th, Baker advanced east toward Dashukivka, with elements of the 16th Panzer Division guarding his left flank. When 2 T-34s were spotted moving suspiciously into a shallow depression, Bake immediately called for air support. White flares fired from German tanks marked the target. Moments later, Stukas screamed down onto Soviet armor hidden in ambush. Forced into the open, the T-34s were met by the 88mm guns of Bake's Tiger Battalion, firing from roughly 2,000 yards. More Soviet tanks appeared, attempting to outflank the Tigers, only to be engaged by Panthers from Bake's battalion and the 16th Panzer Division. Stukas tore apart Soviet anti-tank gun positions. When the fighting subsided, German units claimed 70 Soviet tanks and 40 anti-tank guns destroyed at the cost of 5 Tigers and 4 Panthers. Dashukivka, Chesnovka and Kijinci fell into German hands. Watching the advance, Manstein sent a message to 3rd Panzer Corps. Despite the mud and the Russians, much had already been achieved. What remained, he emphasized, was the final step. Teeth clenched. Forward. Lieutenant Colonel Heinz Frank's battle group pushed further east and forced its way into heavily defended Lysyanka on the Gniloy Tikich. The fighting was close and deliberate. Supported by Stuka dive bombers, Panthers and Panzer Grenadiers fought their way down to a ford and established a fragile bridgehead on the northern bank. Progress beyond that point slowed almost immediately. Large elements of Frank's parent formation, the 1st Panzer Division, were immobilized in deep mud south of Lysyanka, engines running but tracks going nowhere. To the north, the Leibstandarte Division, what remained of the 16th Panzer Division, and the entire 17th Panzer Division were tied down defending the northern flank of 3rd Panzer Corps. At the same time, the 198th and 34th Infantry Divisions were fully engaged against the Soviet 40th Army around Stalingrad and Tinovka, fighting to prevent a counterstroke that could collapse the entire relief effort. Von Bormann continued attacking wherever he could, determined to draw Soviet attention away from Breith's advance. With grenadiers clinging to the hulls, tanks of the 11th Panzer Division forced a crossing of the Spolka River at Yerki. North of the town, mortar shells slammed down among the advancing vehicles. Infantry scattered for cover as Soviet anti-tank guns opened fire from concealed positions. The Panthers responded immediately, knocking out the gun crews without suffering losses. Yet success on the battlefield meant little without fuel. By February 13th, only 3 out of 20 Panthers in the division were still combat capable. The rest stood silent, empty of fuel. The bridgehead at Iskrenoy had already been abandoned, and renewed attempts by the 13th Panzer Division to force a crossing at Yukivka were beaten back by determined Soviet resistance. Like their machines, the men themselves were being ground down. Many German soldiers were suffering from what was known as Volhynian fever, a typhoid-like disease that spread rapidly under frontline conditions. Even Major General Gustav von Wietersheim, commanding the 11th Panzer Division, required regular injections just to remain on his feet and continue issuing orders. Worn-out boots and socks left feet exposed to frostbite and trench foot, lice-infested uniforms. Sleep came in minutes snatched between shelling and movement. Endurance was becoming as decisive as firepower. Inside the pocket, SS Viking captured the village of Shenderivka on February 11th. It was designated as the main assembly point for the planned breakout. To shorten the distance to the approaching relief forces, Stemmermann ordered attacks toward the southwest. Wrapped in white snow smocks, the remaining 689 grenadiers of Major Robert Kästner's 105th Regiment struck without warning. They surprised and overwhelmed the 1st Soviet defensive belt in the darkness. Around midnight, Kästner called forward a self-propelled 20mm anti-aircraft gun. It raked a Soviet fuel column on the outskirts of Novobuda. Trucks erupted into towering fireballs, lighting the night sky. Kästner's men seized Novobuda, while 2 other regiments of the 72nd Infantry Division, supported by elements of SS Wiking and SS Wallonien, captured Komarivka and Kilki. The German gains triggered alarm at the highest level. Stalin responded by placing Konev in command of all Soviet forces surrounding the pocket. As Group Stemmermann pushed closer to the relief formations, Soviet pressure on the eastern edge intensified. The Germans were forced to abandon ground they could no longer hold. On February 13th, Soviet troops occupied the airfield at Korsun. By that point, the ground had become so soft that aircraft could barely take off anyway. With the airfield lost, survival depended entirely on breaking through to 3rd Panzer Corps. Breith flew into Lysyanka in a Fieseler Storch observation aircraft to assess the situation personally. From the ground, the problem was immediately clear. A narrow but steeply banked stream blocked Frank's advance toward Oktyabrsk. In the fading light of dusk, Sergeant Hans Strippel's Panther moved forward and destroyed 2 camouflage T-34s guarding a 40-ton bridge across the stream. The bridge was captured intact. The moment proved decisive. Breith shifted the main effort away from Bake and the 16th Panzer Division, whose route east of Kijinci led into terrain unsuitable for tanks, and placed his weight behind Frank's battle group. To block 3rd Panzer Corps, the Soviet 18th Tank Corps dug in around Dzhozhinci. At the same time, 2 tank brigades from the 20th Tank Corps pushed toward Lysyanka, tightening the ring. North of Kijinci, Franz Barker's 6 Panthers ran into Soviet armor and destroyed 8 T-34s, but at the cost of 3 Panthers knocked out. Swinging south of Kijinci, Barker committed his 6 Tigers. At close range, they brewed up 11 more Soviet tanks. Several Tigers were hit and immobilized, sitting helpless in the mud as crews prepared to fight on foot if necessary. Frank scraped together reinforcements from the Leibstandarte. Grenadiers crowded onto whatever armor was still running. 1 assault gun, a Panzer IV, a Panther, a Tiger, men clinging to steel, already scarred by battle. The relief force was painfully thin. With such limited strength, the prospect of reaching Group Stemmermann looked increasingly hopeless. Tank battles raged between Dzержinci and Oktyabr on February 16th. German artillery pinned down Soviet infantry, while Sergeant Hans Strippel and 7 Panthers maneuvered through smoke and broken ground. In a series of sharp engagements, they claimed 27 T-34s destroyed for the loss of a single Panther. Columns of black smoke rose where Stukas from the Immelmann wing struck Soviet anti-tank gun positions along the forest edge east of Oktyabr. As Soviet crews scrambled back to their remaining guns, Baker's Tigers caught them in the open and finished the job. Bake and Frank then established a defensive screen west of Dzержinci and Hill 239, bracing for counterattack. To the west, the horizon burned, cannon fire flashed through the night, and the distant thunder of armour rolled across the frozen fields. Inside the pocket, one question consumed every man. When would the relief force arrive? Hitler had forbidden any breakout from what he still called the fortress on the Dnieper, yet reality could no longer be denied. On February 16th, Manstein radioed Stemmermann a single message. The password was freedom, objective, Lysianka. Time, 11 p.m. Stemmermann replied without hesitation. There was no other chance. It was now or never. Wöhler ordered that Lieb would lead the breakout. Stemmermann would stay behind with the rearguard. Word spread quickly. Exhausted, mud-covered soldiers straightened up. Waiting was over. They would move. That night, despite low cloud, Soviet U-2 biplanes skimmed over Shenderivka, strafing positions at treetop height. Fires from the burning village lit the ground below, guiding Soviet artillery onto the densely packed German troops. Amid the destruction, the headless body of a staff officer lay outside the Corps headquarters. Men paused briefly, scribbling final lines on scraps of paper, making duplicate copies and exchanging them with comrades in case they did not survive. Classified documents were burned. Vehicles that could not cross the terrain or had no fuel were destroyed where they stood. The hardest decision came at the field hospital in Shenderivka. 1,450 critically wounded men were left behind with volunteer medical staff. Others were loaded onto carts and sledges, wrapped in blankets against the cold. Stemmermann issued a final order. No violations of the laws of war were to occur. Any brutality would invite reprisals against the wounded left behind. The breakout route funneled through Shenderivka, but disaster struck immediately. The only bridge collapsed under the weight of a tank, creating a deadly bottleneck. Repairs under fire turned the crossing into a killing ground. Soviet rocket launchers, known to the Germans as Stalin's organs, saturated the area. Every type of vehicle was caught in the barrage. Fuel trucks burned fiercely. Horses screamed and thrashed in the snow as they died. Clusters of soldiers were cut down by machine gun fire, some coughing blood as they lay face down, others staring blankly upward. A few still tried to crawl forward through the mud and smoke. Major Leon de Grelle later recalled the scene as pure annihilation. A flood of men and machines crushed under fire, with no way back and no shelter ahead. Only 4 to 5 miles now separated Bryth's forward elements from Group Stemmermann. Burdened with ammunition and moving on foot, Major Robert Kaestner's 105th Regiment led the 72nd Infantry Division out of Kilki. The time was 11 p.m. on February 16th. The sky was black and moonless. Temperatures had dropped sharply, and icy winds cut through snow-filled gullies and over frozen ridgelines. Absolute silence was enforced. No fires, no smoking, no talking. Every sound carried in the still night. Once again, the 105th achieved surprise. The first Soviet defensive belt was eliminated at close range. Knives, entrenching tools, rifle butts, quiet, brutal work in the dark. Reconnaissance teams soon identified T-34s guarding the road south of Dzержinci. Using folds in the terrain, Kaestner's men slipped past the tanks unseen. They reached the second defensive belt, facing outward toward the west. Soviet soldiers slept in their foxholes, unaware. They were killed where they lay. Some managed to fire a few shots before dying. That was enough. Soviet tanks suddenly switched on their searchlights, slicing through the darkness and illuminating the following battalions of the 72nd Infantry Division. Kaestner and his men melted back into the night, hearts pounding, pushing forward through shadow and snow. Then they saw new silhouettes ahead. For a moment, fear seized them, then relief. German crosses were visible on the hulls. They had reached 3rd Panzer Corps. On the northern and southern flanks, Corps Detachment B and SS Wiking experienced similar initial success. Forward battalions surprised Soviet positions and managed to infiltrate gaps in the tank screen. But the rest of Group Stemmermann was not so fortunate. Lacking sufficient anti-tank weapons, large columns were forced southward by alerted Soviet armour along the Dzerzhinsky-Pochopintsy road. Mortars, artillery, anti-tank guns and machine guns opened up. German units were caught in the open and shredded. Snowstorms and darkness degraded Soviet accuracy, but sheer volume compensated. In the confusion, formations dissolved. Units fragmented into knots of men moving blindly westward, guided only by instinct and tracer fire. The most dangerous task fell to the rearguard. They faced an enemy now fully alert, and dawn stripped away the last protection of darkness. At the northern corner of the pocket, the 88th Infantry Division held until 5:15 in the morning. The 57th Infantry Division abandoned Komarivka an hour later. Around the same time, General Theo Helmut Lieb personally led the final infantry column west out of Kilki. Wearing a tall white fur cap and mounted on his gelding, Lieb rode straight into the snowstorm, refusing to leave his men behind. At Novo Buda, Walloon platoons disengaged one after another, each covering the next. The last held until 10 a.m. On the eastern edge of Shenderivka, the final German tanks of Group Stemmermann made their stand. They fought until ammunition was gone, holding off waves of T-34s and newly arrived Joseph Stalin II heavy tanks. They churned the snow into black mud as they withdrew through the collapsing mass of infantry. Not one survived. Near Pochopintsy, Stemmermann himself was killed when his half-track was struck by an anti-tank gun. The commander of the pocket died where he stood. Years of occupation, scorched earth retreat, and German atrocities now exploded into raw vengeance. Soviet tank crews crushed wounded Germans lying on Panzer wagons. Horses screamed as tracks flattened them. Soviet soldiers later claimed they found wounded Germans shot in the back of the head and ambulance vehicles burned with bodies inside. Some of these killings were acts of rage. Others were carried out deliberately to spare the wounded from torture or mutilation once captured. Mercy and brutality merged into the same act. West of Pochopintsy, Corporal Fritz Hamann of Panzerjäger Battalion 389, accompanied by his staff sergeant, crawled up a slope towards Soviet tanks firing downhill at fleeing Germans. The tank crews never noticed them. Each man carried 3 Panzerfausts. One by one, they fired at point-blank range. 5 tanks were destroyed in rapid succession. The shape-charge warheads punched effortlessly through T-34 armor. Fireballs and smoke engulfed the slope, masking their position. The remaining 4 tanks withdrew. A narrow escape route opened toward the beech forest southwest of Pochopintsy. Through that gap, the last survivors of Group Stemmermann fled westward. Although Soviet machine gun positions ringed its edges, the wood offered one priceless advantage: tanks could not enter. Within the trees, groups of Germans found temporary refuge and a chance to fight their way west in small, scattered elements. Among those who reached the cover of the forest were Leon de Grelle and most of the Walloon volunteers. Having already survived tank fire and repeated Cossack cavalry charges in the open, the Walloons regrouped in the woods south of Hill 239. There, joined by several thousand stragglers, including Ukrainian civilians fleeing west in terror of Soviet retribution, the remaining 632 Walloons finally reached an outpost of the 1st Panzer Division on February 18th. Most German survivors, including Fritz Hamann and his Panzerjägers, bypassed the forest entirely and drifted south toward the Gniloy Tikich River. Elements of the 72nd Infantry Division were the first to reach its banks. The river itself was deceptively narrow, barely 20 to 30 yards across, but it was deep, fast-moving, and bordered by steep, icy embankments. After dawn, a Soviet tank appeared on the far bank and opened fire on German supply vehicles clustered near the water. Moments later, it drove into a deep gully and became immobilized, a silent witness to the chaos unfolding around it. Throughout the day and into the night, shattered remnants of Corps Detachment B and SS Viking arrived along different stretches of the river. Desperate attempts were made to construct makeshift bridges from horse-drawn panges, branches, and saplings. The current swept them away almost immediately. Soviet artillery soon found the massed Germans on the eastern bank. Shells tore through packed ranks of men, carts, and animals. As more T-34s approached, panic spread. Men stripped off equipment and plunged into the water, exhausted, wounded, and numb from cold. Hundreds were dragged under by the swirling current. General Lieb spurred his horse forward and forced it into the river. He reached the far bank alive. His horse did not. Hamann attempted to cross, where the river appeared frozen nearly halfway across. Crawling forward on his stomach, he felt the ice crack beneath him. Then it gave way completely. For nearly half an hour, he clung to drifting ice floes, fingers numb, body weakening, before a rifle butt was thrust toward him from the western bank. He grabbed it and was hauled to safety. Behind him, his staff sergeant was swept away and vanished beneath the water. The 57th and 88th Infantry Divisions were the last to reach the river. Among them were Ukrainian women who had served the Germans as auxiliaries and now feared what Soviet captivity would bring. By the morning of February 18th, crude footbridges had finally been completed. They swayed under the weight of men and animals, but held long enough for many to cross. Panjers carrying 600 wounded were dragged over plank by plank, every step under threat of artillery fire. Soaked, freezing, and harried by sporadic Soviet fire from behind, the survivors staggered onward toward Lysyanka. The first aid station, set up in a large factory building, was overwhelmed almost immediately. Thousands of wounded lay packed inside. The air was thick with blood, sweat, rot, and disinfectant. Used bandages, crawling with lice, covered the floor. Medical staff wrapped their boots with strips of cloth soaked in Lysol, trying to keep the insects at bay while they worked without rest. For many, survival came at a terrible cost. Exposure, disease, wounds, and exhaustion left most of the escapees unfit for combat for months. The men who emerged from the pocket were alive, but physically shattered. Remnants of formations that had ceased to exist somewhere between the snow, the mud, and the frozen waters of the Niloy Tikich. On the night of February 18th into February 19th, Lieutenant Alexander Fadin's actions at Dashukivka earned him a recommendation for the Golden Star of Hero of the Soviet Union. Operating alone in his T-34, Fadin drove straight into the fight. He suppressed German machine gun positions, crushed a Nebelwerfer rocket launcher beneath his tracks, and cleared the way for Soviet infantry to retake the village. Using a hut on the northern edge for cover, his tank set a German vehicle column ablaze. He then spotted a group of German officers observing the battlefield through binoculars and cut them down with cannon fire. 2 Panzer IV tanks attempting to flank him were destroyed in quick succession. A German reconnaissance aircraft flying low overhead was shot down. As German infantry counterattacked, Fadin swept them with machine gun fire and fragmentation rounds. At close range, he engaged and knocked out a Tiger tank at roughly 150 yards. Flames slowly engulfed the heavy vehicle. 1 crewman hung lifeless from the turret. Moments later, Fadin's T-34 was hit twice by an assault gun. The loader was killed instantly. The turret was mangled. Fadin bailed out just before another round struck the tank. When he realized his driver was still alive but trapped by the jammed hatch, he ran back under fire. Bleeding heavily, the driver was freed and carried on Fadin's shoulders to safety. By February 19th, 3rd Panzer Corps pulled back from Lysyanka. Of the 59,000 men encircled in the Korsun pocket at the start of the battle, 28,000 soldiers and 1,000 Hiwis emerged unscathed. 11,000 wounded had been evacuated by air earlier or brought out during the breakout. 19,000 were killed or captured. 313 guns and howitzers and 50 tanks were lost inside the pocket. Outside it, 1st Panzer Army and 8th Army suffered a further 10,000 casualties, roughly 2/3 of them wounded. 240 tanks and assault guns were lost. Only about 1/3 were destroyed by enemy fire. The rest broke down in mud, snow, or during retreat and could not be recovered. Soviet losses were not officially acknowledged at the time. Under communist rule, such figures were forbidden to be published. Only after the opening of archives following 1990 did the scale become clear. First and Second Ukrainian fronts had suffered roughly 80,000 casualties, including 24,000 killed or missing. Tank and assault gun losses reached approximately 850 vehicles. On February 18th, 224 guns fired a 20-round salute in Moscow to mark the destruction of the Korsun pocket. Soviet propaganda claimed double the actual German casualties and exaggerated German tank losses by 200%. Stalin publicly credited Konev and the Second Ukrainian Front and promoted him to Marshal of the Soviet Union. On the ground, German panzer counterattacks resealed the gap between 8th Army and 1st Panzer Army. The front stabilized briefly, but the damage was done. The battle had shattered Group Stemmermann. Its divisions required complete rebuilding. The Soviets had broken the German line on the Dnieper and driven the front further west. Victory came at immense cost, a pattern that would continue. Before the war ended, another 9 million Soviet soldiers would be killed, wounded, or captured before the Red Army finally stood victorious amid the ruins of Berlin. And that brings this video to a close. I hope you found it interesting and learned something new. If you enjoyed it, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and I appreciate every one of you who supports the work I do here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, and goodbye for now.